Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to The Finer Point. Tonight we have a very special guest. His name is Fred Sievert, and let me tell you a little bit about him before we get involved in the interview. I've been following GodRevealed.com, his website, and I stumbled upon this book that he has written that looks like it would be an awesome, awesome tool to help us all in our walk. Now, Fred has had a very successful career. I would have to say Father blessed him in his career. He was the president of New York Life Insurance Company, and he went on to receive a lot of accolades and awards. And yet, at age 59, he retired so he could go to Divinity School. Went to Yale. That's right in my state here. And he and his wife Sue have been married for 44 years, have 3 adopted daughters and 2 natural-born sons and 3 granddaughters. So there's some more blessings. And the name of the book is God Revealed, Revisit Your Past to Enrich Your Future. Fred, welcome to the show. How are you doing this evening?
Thank you, Dorothy. I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me on the show.
Okay, do you want to tell us about your own spiritual journey and how Father initially brought you into his embrace?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I think, what's somewhat unique about my story is not only the fact that I was a top executive with strong faith, but also that I was not raised in what I'll call an overtly religious family. And as a result of that, I didn't enjoy kind of the learnings in my formative years of biblical principles and sort of the rich stories of the Bible. But on the other hand, I also was not indoctrinated into a single faith tradition. And in a funny way, that was an advantage to me because it required me to rationally come to my own conclusions, and I think it gives a lot of credibility to my faith and my testimony. And, as a result, even now, at age 65, I've really come throughout my life to marvel at the wonder of God and his creation and spend a little less time fretting over doctrinal issues and differences. But you asked about sort of my faith journey, and what's interesting is it started at a very young age, when I was 12. And in fact, this story is the very first story in my book. It's called My Mystical Adolescent Experience. And when I was 12, I was in my bedroom one afternoon when my parents were at work and my brother was out playing, and I just lay on the bed and I started to think about, sort of what at the time I didn't realize were heavy theological questions, but they were. How could God be infinite? How could there be no beginning and no end? How did the universe come to be? How was it created? And as I was on my bed thinking through these questions and issues, I went into sort of this mystical state. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't dreaming. It's hard to describe adequately, but I really felt myself to be in God's presence. And that experience, almost, I'm reluctant to call it an out-of-body experience because it wasn't really an out-of-body experience, but it was almost in that same nature of, my soul being lifted to a higher plane and feeling God's presence sort of warmly embracing me. And at that very moment, I really came to a strong faith in the existence of God. And at that time, I didn't know a lot about the Bible. I didn't know a lot about Jesus Christ, but I felt God's presence. And, you know, the feeling escaped me in about, 5 minutes. And then I tried to recreate it, and I only recreated it one more time. And I tell in the story of my book that what's interesting is many years later, when I was in Divinity School and taking a medieval theology class, I was reading Augustine's Confessions, and I discovered that he went through almost an identical experience. And he also felt himself pulled away from this presence of God the way I did. He was older than I was. He was older than 12, and he felt that he was being pulled away because of his carnal nature. I didn't have those thoughts, but the interesting thing is he too enjoyed that experience one more time and then never again. And I just felt like God was speaking to me across the centuries, you know, communicating to me that at age 59 or 60 that I had this same experience as a child that St. Augustine had and talked about in his Confessions. And that sort of became the foundation for my faith from that point forward. You know, I really felt very strongly, very strong faith in the existence of God and the fact that I had found myself in His presence. And, you know, I told this same story to church leaders probably, you know, when I was around 50 years old. I was a deacon of my church, and we had an off-site meeting, and everybody talked about their faith experience. And it was the first time I really revealed that experience. I guess I felt people would think I was kind of on the lunatic fringe, you know, and I hadn't really revealed it. The interesting thing is 2 people out of a group of about 20 told me they had exactly the same experience in their lives. And I wondered, if perhaps this was God, you know, sort of preparing me for a lay leadership in my case, and in one of the other person's cases it was a clergy experience, but preparing me for lay leadership by giving me this very strong faith. And, you know, I think there's some truth to that. And since then, since I've written the book and people have read that story, I've had a number of people tell me they had very, very similar experiences. So that was the beginning of it, you know, and then from that point forward I had a strong faith. Of course, I went through struggles like everybody does. You know, I maintained the faith. I maintained a prayer life. I maintained a Bible study when I could throughout my 20s and 30s and 40s and so on. But it was really that foundation that enabled me, I think, to stay the course and gave me kind of a burning desire to learn more. And, you know, the Lord has blessed me tremendously, as you indicated in the introduction, with a wonderful life and some great experiences. And, you know, I'm viewing the book as an opportunity really to impact a lot of other people's lives through my experiences. And as you said, the subtitle of the book is Revisit Your Past to Enrich Your Future. And what I'm finding is really the theme of the book, and the way in which it's being best utilized is people read my stories. It's really not about me. It's attempting to create a memory trigger for the reader to go back through their own history and their own background and their own experiences and identify perhaps even times when they may have not realized it and may have overlooked it, that God was in their life. God was guiding them and directing them and carrying them through difficult times. And I'm finding that even though the book is just starting to be mailed out this week, there are a number of people who got the Kindle version early and others who I had pre-release copies of the book from the publisher that I sent out to maybe 100 of my friends, and they're giving me that feedback that, you know, the subtitle is perfect, Revisit Your Past to Enrich Your Future, because people read it not to read about me. They read it to think about their own life and their own experience and their own encounters with God. So that's sort of a summary. Sorry, a little long-winded, but that's sort of my spiritual background and path.
Well, I know for me, I also was touched at age 12, and it's such an intimate experience that I was reluctant for the longest time to share it with anyone myself, because, you know, it is so intimate when Father touches you like that.
Yeah.
And then when it's gone, you go, am I crazy? Did I imagine it? And through the years, you know, he reinforces the first, you know, but, excuse me, it's such an intimate and faith-building experience when he touches you at that age. That's such a formative age, you know?
Yes. Yeah,
and,
the first chapter of my book, Dorothy, is entitled God Revealed in Faith-Stirring Experiences. You triggered that thought when you said that. And these were kind of all experiences in which I really palpably felt God's presence right then in the moment. And, you know, those experiences really hit you and stick with you and have a profound impact. And I think most people, most believers, have had that kind of an experience, and you don't forget those. Now, there's some you may not realize, you know, were really God's intervention. But the ones in that part of my book, that first chapter, it was very clear to me that God was present and speaking to me.
Yeah. Excuse me, having a little trouble with allergies tonight. My mind just went for a walk. It didn't take me with it. I'm a little older myself, so I really like the fact that, you know, when I read your website, and I've read a few of the stories, I know it blesses me a great deal to hear of other experiences. And it helps me almost broaden my outlook as to how Father really works, where you haven't looked in that area before, and when you're in those moments in your life when everything is so emotional and drama, and you cry out to God and you go, where are you, where are you? And then when you do look back, he was there. It's just that you were so verklempt you couldn't hear him and you couldn't see him. So I love hearing about other people's stories. And
yeah, Dorothy, I just want to relate to you an experience I had about a month ago. At my church, the men's group had become kind of a social event, you know, with very little spiritual discussion or impact. And they asked me to do a dinner meeting in which I talked about the book and I talked about a couple of specific stories from the book in an effort to trigger discussion. And so I put a lot of time into preparing for that. We had two segments, one where I kind of talked about, you know, in order to break people in an easy way, I talked kind of about my career and how I balanced my faith with my family responsibilities and my career aspirations. And then as they were serving the salad dish, we gave each of about 8 tables of men a couple of questions to talk about. And we had orchestrated this in advance, and we had somebody at each table controlling or moderating the discussion. And so we did that first segment. We broke, and, you know, you could tell there was a tremendous amount of engagement at each table and a lot of discussion. You know, and part of the issue is that, you know, I don't want this to sound sexist, but I think men are even more reluctant to share their faith and their faith stories than women. And I think that was one of the things the leaders of that men's group were trying to get me to encourage, is this faith sharing. And then, they talked about that. Then I got up and told one of the stories from my book, and again asked questions while they were eating their entree. Same kind of engagement at each table. And then after the entree, we had each table kind of get up, a leader from each table get up and talk about, anything interesting that was discussed. And this was a very emotional event. There was a lot of really personal sharing. I got a lot of positive feedback both that evening and in emails after the event. And probably the most powerful example was one of the men sent me a note, and he said, Fred, I was at a table with guys I've known for 15 years, but I really didn't know them till tonight. So it really was an opportunity for people to share their faith, share their experiences, and obviously they just hadn't had a forum that encouraged that. And I think my book tries to do that both on an individual basis. If you read it and you react to the questions and the reflection pieces at the end of each story, and then there are exercises at the end of each chapter, even if you just did it alone, or if you did it with your spouse or with your family, I think you'd find a level of sharing that you hadn't enjoyed and experienced before. And you know as well as I do that there's no better way to renew spirituality than through the sharing of personal faith stories. Even sermons are, the best sermons you've heard are ones in which you're hearing some remarkable faith-based experience. And that's what I'm trying to generate with the book, and I think so far it seems to be working in that way.
Yes, it is. Like I said, it's very faith-building to hear other people's experiences, and it just widens your perception.
Yeah.
And, your career was very, when I worked, a career like with a life insurance company, that's very stressful and very demanding. And did you get chances to bring your faith into the workplace? Was it verboten, or how did you balance all that while building a family at the same time?
Yeah, it was. It certainly was stressful, and New York Life's a very big company, a Fortune 100 company, and at the time I retired had about 65,000 agents and employees around the globe, really. And so it was a very huge responsibility. And that's one of the reasons I retired early is I didn't feel I had adequately given attention to my spiritual education and development. But, as I said earlier, I was involved in the church. I was a deacon and a trustee and got involved in a lot of activities. But, I developed kind of coping techniques that may seem a bit unusual and may not be something everybody can replicate. But, in fact, by the way, I had a production crew out to my house a couple of months ago, and they asked me a lot of questions and videotaped my answers. They're actually on YouTube. The site, I think, is called God Revealed Book on the YouTube site. And there's answers to a lot of these kinds of questions with me in a videotape answering the questions. And one of the questions that they asked, they just started the camera running, and they asked me this very question that you just asked, how did you cope with all of these challenges? And it wasn't easy, and I often felt I was failing, but I developed some coping techniques that I can just mention here, as I did on that videotape. One of the things that, for some odd reason, I was one of these people who could thrive and survive on less than the typical amount of sleep. I probably slept around 5 hours a night on average, and yet it didn't seem to negatively affect me. So, I picked up added time just because I wasn't spending so much of it sleeping. But my daily routine is kind of revealing in terms of balancing and coping. I would get up every day at 4 a.m. And what's interesting is I don't think I ever remember waking up to an alarm clock. I mean, I had my own internal alarm, and I was up at 4 a.m. every day. And then I'd go work out on an exercise bike, a stationary bike. And I chose that vehicle intentionally because, being a type A workaholic kind of personality, I wanted to keep my hands free so I could multitask. So I was on the bike and I was answering emails and delegating things to my staff. This is at 4 in the morning, between 4 and 5 in the morning. But, it wasn't long after I started that routine that I realized I had to balance my family responsibilities as well, and I started to send emails daily to my wife and my 5 kids. And they were always quite short. They'd end with, "I love you and I'm proud of you." I didn't always get a response, unless I said, "Please acknowledge receipt of this message." And when I did that, I'd get a 2-word response, "Got it," and not much more. But, I knew that the kids appreciated that because if I missed a day or two for some reason, like I was traveling or whatever, one of the kids would invariably send me a note and say, "Hey, Dad, what's up? No message today?" So, it's always better to speak directly to your kids and your wife or your spouse, but at least I was maintaining the connection and asking them about what's happening in their lives and if there are any issues I could help them with. Then after I got off the exercise bike and did that, then I would do a devotional reading of a chapter in the Bible. I think when I first started the practice, I do a chapter at a time, and I went through, the Gospels initially. There's 99 chapters in the 4 Gospels, so I kind of viewed that as my 3-month startup plan. And I purposely didn't read more than a chapter because even though there was a temptation to do that, I used a version of the Bible that had some level of commentary in it. And so, I spent time really thinking about it and reading it carefully. And then after doing that, I'd pull out my daily prayer list, which I still keep to this day on my BlackBerry. Usually, almost always intercessional prayer for others, not for myself, for others, for my family members, and so on. And I go through that prayer list. So by 6 a.m., before most people were out of bed, I had this great sense of accomplishment. I did the physical workout. I attended to some work-related things, and I gave priority to my faith and my family. I heard from God by reading the Scriptures, and I spoke to God in prayer. And I communicated with my family through email. So, these were kind of my coping techniques. Now, there was another thing that was very important that I did that's a practice that has been adopted by a great number of New York Life agents and employees, and that is, starting when my oldest daughter was 9, I started taking each one of my 5 kids on a trip with me alone every year. So it often was just a weekend. It often wasn't far away, but it gave me some really quality bonding time one-on-one with the kids, all 5 of them once a year. Now, obviously, that's not enough time to spend with your kids, and you got to do a lot more face-to-face talking with your kids. But those are very memorable experiences, really good bonding experiences. And, the way kids are today, listening to their headphones and playing with their phones and their iPad and so on, it's hard to get their attention. But when you go away somewhere for a couple of days, it may take initially a couple of hours to connect again, but you end up spending a lot of really quality time talking. And as I said, the kids just, remember every aspect of every one of those trips. And my wife was very supportive of that, did some of it herself. But I told stories to New York Life agents and employees, thousands of New York Life agents and employees about that practice and about those trips. And, as successful as the company was, I think my legacy to the company really was family values and my faith, much more than it was the success of the company. So in that sense, I brought faith to the workplace. That was your original question. I just want to finish off the answer to that, because I think I'm sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Early in my career, like many people do, I made the mistake of making worship and prayer a Sunday-only activity. But but still relatively early in my career, I realized that I've got to invite God into the workplace. And I've got to pray often, talk to God multiple times daily. And in fact, it's not an exaggeration to say that I probably prayed 10 to 15 times a day. Often, just very short prayers, asking God to guide me and direct my words and actions, help me with difficult decisions, help me to act with integrity and with strong ethics. It was never really prayers about, making a sales goal or making a profit goal or anything like that. It was much more about my behavior and how I wanted to be a good role model and set an example and follow Christian and biblical principles. So, it's probably fair to say, given 65,000 employees and agents at New York Life, every possible faith was represented in that group. So, as president of the company, I didn't mind expressing my faith, but I didn't, sort of overtly evangelize either, but I didn't hide it. And no one, just as evidence of that, no one was surprised when they heard I was retiring early and going to Divinity School. I think, there wasn't any surprise at all. Outside the company, people who didn't know me, kind of scratched their head. How would you give up this lucrative job and leave when you had 5 or 6 more years you could have continued to work and go off to Divinity School? But the people at New York Life clearly understood why I did that. So that's sort of, the story. I didn't hold prayer meetings every day with my staff. I didn't do that because, on my staff we had Muslims and Jews and, every imaginable denomination within the Christian faith. And, I didn't feel, they knew my faith. They knew the strength of my faith. I talked about it often. And I think that was enough. And a lot of people did tell me how much they appreciated that. A great number of people.
So you didn't give them a chance to be offended at Jesus' name. You just shared your personal journey with them, which was probably the best way to go because it made it more real to them. Yeah, exactly.
And what's interesting, Dorothy, is at we'd have big conventions, thousands of agents. And, I think some of our conventions had 5,000 agents, sales conventions. And I always spoke, as president of the company, I always had a platform presentation. And, I often talked about my faith. At one of those meetings, or a series of those meetings, we had members of our board of directors invited and sitting kind of in the front row of the audience. And I remember after talking about the business and sales results and profit results and our strategies, I went on to talk about my priorities in life with 5 members of the board of directors sitting in the first row. And I said, my priorities in this order are my relationship with my God, my relationship with my spouse, my relationship with other family members, my job, and finally my leisure activity and volunteer work. And so can you imagine, the president of a Fortune 100 company revealing to his board of directors that his job was 4th on his priority list? That's
I bet they were amused.
Yeah, the thing is, they already knew me, right? They already knew about my faith. They weren't surprised by that at all. And actually, I was quite candid about it and said, it's a constant battle to keep those priorities in order. And oftentimes, you can get them upside down. And, the 5th priority was leisure activity and volunteer work, and I never had much time for that, so I wasn't worried about getting that upside down. But the job, you could get the 1 through 4 priorities upside down and spend too much time on the job. But, as long as you know what your priorities are, and your listeners' priorities may be different than mine, but as long as you know them and you articulate them and you remind yourself often of those priorities, that's the best way to keep them in balance and rebalance them when they get a little out of whack. And, I think it's just an important message to make sure you know what your priorities are, what's important to you. And I hope that we're all putting God and our relationship with God first.
Yeah, there's a lot of depth to the scripture about seek ye first the kingdom, and all the rest, the way I see it, all the rest will fall into place. I know that's not literally what it says, but to me that's what it means. If you take care of me first and seeking me first, then all the rest falls into place. And, you're blessed tremendously when you do it that way.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but you went to Yale Divinity School.
Yes.
Well, that's here in Connecticut. Now, I grew up in this area, and I remember learning in school, it was settled by the Puritans, we're all conservative here. But when you live here, the reality is a little bit different.
Yeah.
It's very liberal here, which surprises me almost daily, how liberal this area is.
Yes. Yeah, and I considered other schools, but, the proximity to Yale and the quality, the prestige of the institution, and the fact that 3 of my ministers at my church had gone to Yale Divinity School as adults, as middle-aged adults, and really benefited from the experience and encouraged me to go there. So even though initially I thought, maybe I'd be better off going to Princeton or somewhere else, I went to Yale, and I prayed about it. I went to Yale, and what was interesting is, even though it's fairly liberal, even in the Divinity School, there was an openness to other points of view. There was a willingness to debate and discuss various issues and beliefs, and I was glad that I went to a place like that where there was significant diversity along many dimensions. I mean, the diversity went across, gender, ethnicity, faith traditions, socioeconomic status, even sexual orientation at the Divinity School. And, it made for a very rich and robust kind of experience, and it sort of opened up my own mind and my own thinking to a different level. I mean, the one common commonality, the near universal commonality among that student body at Yale Divinity School was a belief in a loving and living God. And that sort of bound classmates together despite a lot of differences of opinion on various other things. So, it really was a good experience. And I felt, I was going there at age 59. I took a 2-year program and actually spent 4 years at it. I went half-time because I had so many other responsibilities. And I really enjoyed every minute of it. I mean, being in the classroom, engaging with those students and the faculty. And I wasn't the oldest person there. And, in fact, at the time, 25% of the students were over age 45. So, I found a lot of peers at the institution. And there was just a very loving, open dialogue about issues. And there was often disagreement. But they embraced that and even encouraged that, and I learned a lot. I mean, you've got some of the best theologians and scholars in the world on their faculty, and it was tough. I mean, for someone my age who doesn't have the memory retention that kids in their 20s have, it was difficult to compete. I mean, I had to work very hard at it. But it was a great experience. Really, really was a wonderful experience, and I'm very glad I went through it. I will say though that at my age, retaining what you've learned, it's just like learning a language, and theology has its own jargon and terminology and language, and the older you get, the harder it is to really retain what you've learned. So even though I did well in those classes, sometimes, after taking an Old Testament final exam, a couple of weeks later, I lost a lot of what I had to learn for the exam. But nonetheless, I learned a lot about where I could go, what kind of resources I could use to help me in my future studies, and so on. So it was just a great experience, and I don't regret it for a minute, and I wouldn't go anywhere else. I think it really was wonderful.
So, having never been to Divinity School myself, what types of things do they teach? What topics do they cover?
Mm-hmm. Well, they have a Masters of Divinity track in which you ultimately become ordained. If you go down that track, you spend more time, in the practice of ministering, pastoral care, preaching, that kind of thing. But you also, the one commonality between that degree and the one I got, which was a Master of Arts in Religion, was sort of a comprehensive view, course curriculum that covered, the history of religion, covers theology, covers biblical studies. There were several branches like sacred music and so on that you had to get a certain foundation in all of that, including, practical aspects of ministering, even if you weren't getting the Masters of Divinity. So I took that sort of comprehensive approach. What I found interesting, Dorothy, was I never really, as an undergraduate, I didn't take a single history class. I just didn't like history. And what I found most interesting at Yale Divinity School, and probably the most courses I took, because there were a lot of electives, were the history courses. I really was captivated and amazed at not only the European history of religion, but the American history of religion, where you had some phenomenal preachers and theologians in the 18th century. When people, there weren't cars, there wasn't even electricity, and you had preachers and theologians like Cotton Mather and Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, preaching to huge audiences. I mean, it's said that Whitefield would do outdoor preaching to 20,000 people, in a period.
Wow.
Yeah, it's just amazing. It was like the 18th century Billy Graham, and Jonathan Edwards. He's the most amazing of all, Jonathan Edwards. I mean, he was the senior minister at the church in Northampton, Massachusetts, which was a big church. I think he died in 1758, so that's how long ago this was. And his writings are so prolific, it would just blow you away. And they have all of his writings at Yale. In fact, about 2 months ago, I went through an introduction to all of his writings, his original manuscripts, at Yale in the Beinecke Library, which is the historical library. And he just wrote so much. And you think about him doing that at a time when you didn't even have, ballpoint pens. You didn't have, light bulbs. You had to use artificial light. And he wrote, just as an example, he did these 11 binders of kind of his theological musings, where the pages were each like 9 by 12 in size, and he wrote this tiny, tiny little print, using a feather ink pen. And in this tiny little print, and I've seen it, I've held it in my hands, his most famous speech or sermon was Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And I've held that sermon, his original written version of it, in my hands. And he did this tiny little print, so that, just to give you an example, they've digitalized it. It's taken them 20 years to digitalize all of his work, maybe longer. And just one page out of this binder that's like an inch or an inch and a half thick, on 9.5 by 12-inch paper, both sides, double-sided, tiny, tiny little print, one side of one page. It took them 15 to 20 pages to transcribe it, on the computer to a typed version. And he did 11 binders like that. And he had 1,400 handwritten sermons that are in the Beinecke Library at Yale. This guy was so prolific, it's unbelievable. And the stuff he wrote was deep theological writing. It wasn't easy stuff. So it's just sort of amazing. There's a great book, if any of your listeners is interested. It's the biography of Jonathan Edwards, written by a guy named Marsden, Marsden. Absolutely fascinating. Because you would never think of, the kinds of issues and problems he faced, not to mention, the Indians at the time being a threat, to the colonists. There's just so many issues, but so many issues that are common to today that every minister faces in their church. Rebellious youths and, sexual promiscuity, you name it. It's just a fascinating biography. I'd recommend it to anybody. After I went through that class, I ordered about 10 copies of that book on Amazon and gave them out to a lot of my friends, because I said, you're just not going to believe what you read here. And if you know how prolific this guy was, how he managed to be senior minister of this big church in this environment when you couldn't get around in automobiles, you had to go by horseback, is just incredible. Whitfield's the same way. Whitfield's even more incredible because he traveled up and down the whole coast, and preached in Boston and Philadelphia. In 1739, something like 30% of everything in print, 30% of everything that was printed in 1739 was either written by or about George Whitfield. And it was printed largely by Benjamin Franklin, because he had his printing shop back then, and Whitfield was a friend of his. The whole history of religion in the United States is an amazing study. So I really enjoyed that, and I'm trying to keep up with that even as I'm busy these days with my own book.
Now, I don't know if I'm remembering this correctly, but doesn't Yale have a portion of its library available on the Internet?
Oh, yes. Yeah. And I can't give you off the top of my head how to get in there, but the Jonathan Edwards site is open. Where I told you they transcribed everything and digitalized it, that site is open to anybody. I mean, they have a center. I think it's called the Jonathan Edwards Center. And if you could probably Google it and find it. And you can go in there and research and read much of his original work, either typed out, or in some cases I think you can even scan and see the documents. So it's quite extensive what you can do on the Internet. I just don't remember all the website names.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact address, but I think I stumbled upon it at one point, and it's just amazing what they have, put into the public's hands. So we have no excuse nowadays.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is no excuse to be illiterate about, our past, and it's not like human beings and their problems have changed that dramatically. Our technology has changed, but our day-to-day problems that these people addressed, even I think back then, they were not afraid to address politics of the day, like
right.
ministers are now. So
Yep.
you really get a good education on how to
that's kind of what's so amazing about this biography of Edwards. There's also one on Cotton Mathers that's similar, and that's it just hits you to realize the human condition has been the same for many centuries. People face the same issues and problems, even though the environment and society might have changed. And you can see that in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the New Testament. Look how long ago that was.
Yep. Trouble with kids going the wrong way, and
right.
Trouble with kings going the wrong way.
Exactly.
So that must have been an awesome thing to be able to go and learn that stuff.
Yeah.
So,
I just remember so many times just sitting in class and thinking, how blessed I am to be able to do this now. And I missed the opportunity earlier in life, but it was just so wonderful. And I wasn't terribly worried about the grades I got. A lot of students, especially the younger ones who are looking to find a job at some point, are really hung up about they need the top grade so they can get a top job, and it's not so much about learning. With me, it was all about learning and not about grades. Although my wife will tell you, given my kind of my overachieving nature, I was driving to get good grades, but mainly as just a reinforcement that I was learning something, But it really was about, for me, it was the right reasons to go to school, to learn and to get an education.
Well, I think, at that age, I would rather go later in life than earlier because you just don't have the perception. You don't have the right viewpoint. Your attitudes change so much from when you're a young adult, like you said, trying to get a job and worried about a job and supporting yourself, and later when you can go and just soak in the knowledge,
right.
and just appreciate the knowledge that's being delivered. Yeah. I would love to do something like that, but...
Well, maybe you should, Dorothy.
Well, with the Internet, getting to school is so easy now. You don't even have to travel.
Yeah, there's a lot of distance learning out there. It seems to be, it seems to be accelerating into, a viable way to get a good education, actually.
Okay, we're just about at the top of the hour. Let's take a break now, and then we can talk more about, I know you really started understanding more about how Father had actually been there in all these little things when you started telling your life stories to the kids, like we do as we get older. They say, well, what did you do, when you were my age?
Yeah.
So let's...
You want to talk about that now or after the break?
after the break, let's play a song. Do you have any favorite song that you like? I've got a lot on here.
I'll let you pick something from your repertoire there.
Let's see. Show Me Your Glory by Kim Walker. That's a good one.
Yep.
And that's almost 9 minutes.
Oh, good. Okay. I'll be listening.
So I'm going to go get some more coffee and lubricate my throat.
Yeah, me too. I've been getting over a cold, and I'm okay, but talking too much can aggravate it. Okay, so you're going to play a song now.
I'm going to play a song, and we'll be back in almost 9 minutes.
Okay.
All right. Okay, and we're back. The name of the book we're discussing is God Revealed, Revisit Your Past to Enrich Your Future. We're talking to the author of that book, Fred Sievert. Welcome back, Fred.
Hello, I'm back.
Okay. Got your cup of coffee?
I've got a bottle of water.
Good enough. Okay, we were going to talk about, I love the way you those memories in your children as they were growing, as being constantly in touch with them, because children form their memories, and it just helps them grow better, and helps them stay on track for the most part. So tell me how it first came to you, like when you were telling the kids stories that you started seeing.
Yeah, I'll tell you a bit about the genesis of the book project. It was later in my 4-year Divinity School experience that I had dinner with my daughter Dina and her husband Doug. And over dinner, I just started relating to them stories of interesting experiences in my life. And they weren't all faith-based stories. They were just interesting experiences and encounters that they were, I was a little surprised at how captivated they were by the storytelling. And we enjoyed about a 2.5-3 hour leisurely dinner as I talked through these stories. And near the end of the dinner, my daughter Dina said to me, "Dad, you've probably told thousands of New York Life agents and employees those stories, and many of them you haven't even told to your own family." And that hit me pretty hard because, frankly, she was right. And then she went on to say that you ought to at least memorialize them in writing for us, for the family. So that night and the next day, I just started to make a list of topics that I could write about. And I began to write the stories and share them with some author friends of mine. And they said, well, as a first step, what you ought to do is get some published in magazines. So I did. I got 10 or 12 published in magazines. And then I ended up sharing it with some of the Yale professors, especially the faith-based stories. And one of them, Miroslav Volf, who's a well-known theologian and really a very good friend of mine, put me in touch with his literary agent. And I sent her a number of the stories, and I was surprised. She read them. I sent them in late afternoon, and the next morning early she was calling me because she had read them. And she said, they're very well written, and they're very interesting and inspiring, but she said, let me give you a couple pieces of advice. And she gave me 2 very important pieces of advice. She said, number 1, memoirs of the President of the United States will sell. Memoirs of the President of New York Life will not. So she said, you can't just do memoirs. People aren't going to be all that interested in it. And the second piece of advice was, if you're going to maintain this kind of storytelling format, you need kind of a unifying underlying theme to the stories. So when she said that, I went back, and I had only written maybe 10 stories at that point. I went back to my list of 80 and the 10 that I had written, and I'm looking at them, with an eye to what's sort of the underlying theme. And I realized that a few of the stories involved experiences in my life which I kind of palpably felt God's presence right then in that moment. But, I realized I probably didn't have enough material for a book. I mean, I toyed with the idea of a theme around God's presence or revelation in my life. But, I didn't have enough stories. So then I went through an exercise that was very meaningful. And this exercise ultimately established the theme for the book. And what I did was I began to think through periods in my life when I was having problems, I was struggling, maybe with issues within the family, career challenges, feeling maybe in some cases that my job was in jeopardy, even, some personal failures at work, personal failures with the family. And I started kind of rewinding those tapes, those memories, and replaying them to myself and thinking about what was happening at the time, what was I going through. I mean, I had a very strong faith, so I was praying about these things. And then I asked myself the question, what was the outcome of that event, that situation, and is it possible God was involved and was intervening on my behalf, giving me guidance and direction, and maybe I didn't even realize it at the time. So just going through that thought process and reviewing my background and replaying those tapes ended up surfacing a whole lot of new stories for the book with that theme in mind. And in fact, that's where the title became so important. It was God being revealed to me by revisiting my past. And that's where I've got this subtitle, Revisit Your Past to Enrich Your Future. Because as I said, I'm encouraging my readers and your listeners to do the same thing. That as they read my stories, it's not really about me. It's about the reader thinking about, their own past, their own experiences, things that happened at difficult times in their life in particular, where they came through it, in a way that maybe God was guiding them and directing them. And, that's the value, the real value of the book. Particularly during difficult, stressful, challenging times, I want my readers, and I do it through these questions I ask in the reflection section and the exercises at the end of each chapter, to look for evidence of God guiding them and carrying them through the storm. And I think they will discover, as so many people have told me, by doing that, they're discovering periods in their life where, God was involved. And sometimes our answers to prayer aren't immediate. Sometimes they're very deferred. I mean, sometimes the best answer to a prayer is no, and we don't realize it right away. And I think by reflecting on the past, by thinking about those experiences really thoughtfully, and going back through it in your mind, I think you end up discovering that God was present with you more than you thought, more than you might have realized. And that's, once I came up with that theme, then, out of these 80 stories I had, there were 30 that sort of really struck me as clear examples of situations in my life where God was, in fact, guiding me, giving me messages, directing me. And that's what I tell about in the book. You know, and there have even been stories since then that, you know, if I ever wrote a second book, I'm starting to collect more stories. And, you know, I think for those of us who are really faithful, it started with that 12-year-old experience when I was 12 years old, you know, that I've had this faith, this abiding faith, and I've trusted. You know, you also have to trust that God is really there and that, you know, God's going to answer your prayers and, you know, according to His timing and His will for your life. And, you know, you have to accept that. And it may not always be what you really want in life. It may be what He wants in your life. So that was the genesis of the book, and I think it's going to have a significant impact on a lot of lives if they read it and take the time to think about their own past.
I know I have had similar experiences myself where I've looked back when I thought Father had deserted me and I was just on my own, just, you know. Mm-hmm. And now when I go through trials and tribulations, I keep thinking about all things work to the good to those who love God. And I hold on to that verse so many times, even, you know, and then I have to get through the experience to the other side, and I look back and I go, oh, yeah, there he was right there. And yeah. I hadn't even seen him, you know? It's just...
Yeah, exactly. You know what? One of the best examples of that, you know, deferred answers to prayer is in my book. It's about my kids, because my wife and I were both told independently that we couldn't have children. I couldn't father children. She couldn't give birth to children. So we were told that by doctors. We were told that after, you know, a couple of years of fertility treatment. We ended up adopting 2 Korean orphans when they were babies and 1 special needs child when she was like 2.5 years old. So we had the 3 daughters, Heidi, Dina, and Denise. And, you know, after 16 years of marriage, and thinking we would never have children, we ended up giving birth to a natural-born boy, Zachary, and a year and a half later to our second son, Corey. And, you know, it was God's timing. It was God's timing, and in such a way that, you know, the miracle, I tell people, the miracle wasn't the birth of Zach and Corey. The miracle was the infertility, because that allowed us to experience the miracle of the 3 adopted daughters, you know. And that was the beauty of God's timing in that story. And there was another interesting side story to that one, and that is after the birth of Corey, I ended up getting a vasectomy, you know, which is very ironic, but I ended up getting a vasectomy, and this was 16, 17 years after the fertility treatment had failed, and we were living in a suburb of Detroit, and my urologist sent me to a specialist that was 25 miles away from where I lived for the vasectomy, and it was on the same floor of the same medical building of the doctor who was doing the fertility treatments that we sort of gave up on 16 years earlier. And, you know, I just think that was God's sense of humor, you know, putting me in that same building that was now 20 miles away to go for a vasectomy after being on that same floor and failing to succeed at fertility treatments. And in fact, when I went back there, I went in to see the doctor who went through the fertility treatments, and I told him why I was there, you know, because I just had 2 natural-born children. And he looked at me, just sort of stared at me, And rather than congratulating me or thanking God for this miracle, he just says, well, he did say congratulations, and he walked away. And I thought, that was odd that's the only reaction I got. And I think maybe he was feeling like he had failed where God had succeeded, something like that. But it's just an interesting story, the way that all played out, and how I really, really believe that was an example of God answering prayer according to his timing and not according to my timing.
Like with Sarah in the Bible.
Yes.
How old was she? She was told she was going to have a kid, 99 or something?
Yeah, very, very old, yeah. Right. I guess people lived a lot longer then, but still she was beyond normal childbearing years.
Yes, by a little bit.
Yeah.
But, yeah, that is an amazing story. Because someone who can't have children shouldn't need surgery to not have children, It's just,
right, exactly. Yeah.
It's one of those, well, that doesn't make sense. You don't need that surgery,
yeah, right.
Okay, let's see. Oh, now we talk about everybody has failures in life. You've got to be no different than the rest of us, and you've broached that a little bit. When you had your failures, what did that do to your faith? Did you think maybe Father didn't exist, or if he did, he didn't care, or how did that affect you in those moments?
Yeah, that's a good question. I like everybody else. I've had a lot of failures in my life, at least that I perceive to be failures. And I just gave you an example where I failed to have children. I was praying and nothing seemed to happen. I think part of, and by the way, the book doesn't talk too much about failures. It because it's so upbeat and hopeful and focused on the good things that have happened in my life. But I want my readers to know, and your listeners to know, that just like everybody else, I've had a lot of failures, and not having children. There was a time in my life where there was a lot of financial strain in my marriage, just like many of your listeners. And at one point, I remember having a meeting with a lawyer to talk about what the implications were of filing for bankruptcy. There were several times during my career, even though ultimately I became the president of a Fortune 100 company, there were several times in my career where I felt my job was in jeopardy. And, that list kind of goes on and on. I mean, there were many failures. I had business failures even at New York Life. I talked the management team into buying a company that ultimately failed and was a big write-off for the company. And, I felt like I was grateful that New York Life encouraged me to take that risk and then didn't shoot me when it didn't work out. But I really felt it was a failure, and I felt my job was potentially in jeopardy. But what sustains you through all of that is you have to maintain your faith, and it goes back to that 12-year-old experience. I mean, I really believed God was with me. I believe it today. I believe, the Holy Spirit dwells within me, and I'm being guided and directed. And, I'll get through all those things, and I'll get through them, according to His will, not according to mine. And I just try to remain faithful in prayer to ask for the guidance and the ability to get through that. And, even if I did get fired, even if I did lose my job, even if I did go bankrupt, I mean, I don't think that would, alter my faith. It wouldn't. I would believe that for some reason that needed to happen, and it was part of God's plan. So, there's something to be said for really strong faith and staying faithful to Him. in your prayer life, and trusting that God is with you. So, it carried me through difficult times, for sure. And I think it can do that with everybody. But that's not to say, there aren't accidents that kill our children or our loved ones. There aren't terrible events that occur. There's sin in the world. There's evil in the world. And these things do happen, but you have to rely on your relationship with God to get you through that. And one of my stories in the book is about going back to Poland. My maternal grandfather was Polish, and I went back to Poland. We took a trip to Poland, my wife and I, about 5 years ago, and we went through Auschwitz and Birkenau, and I found myself sobbing uncontrollably as I went through Birkenau, especially, and kind of the museum they've got there. I mean, it's just so hard to understand why this happens, why God let it happen, and didn't intervene sooner. I mean, 10,000 people were being gassed a day. And, I say in the book, I don't have all the answers. I just don't have the answers. And I'm going to ask God some pretty tough questions on the other side, And then I discovered, by the way, totally accidentally, if you read that story, that my grandfather's roots and, where he grew up, which was about 5 miles from Auschwitz. And he left Poland, and I think it was 1918 or something like that. I can't remember, 19. I don't remember when he left, but he left when he was like 18 years old. So he wasn't there for the Holocaust. But, I wondered to myself, what would have happened if he had been there? How would have he reacted to that? He would have been close enough to the gas chambers to smell the fumes. Would he have known what was going on there? I mean, there's tragedy, there's evil. It's out there. But again, we don't have all the answers, and I think we will at some point. But it's some of those things are hard to understand, and I think
it is hard to understand. And I know when I'm trying to figure, I'm a big why person. Still at this age, it's why, and it's a conclusion I've come to. Is the free will thing. Because Father didn't just give us free will. He gave everybody free will. So we are constantly being affected by other people's free will choices.
Yeah, there's no question about that. I agree with you totally. But, think about how many people were praying, for intervention that may or may not have occurred. I mean, there are many examples of where it did, but there are also examples of where that didn't happen. And, maybe somehow there's good reason for that.
I think sometimes, like when a lot of people are concerned about things that are, the tribulation period coming upon the earth.
Yeah.
And many people are going to die, both saved and unsaved. And I think took me a long time to get there, but you know what? If it's my time to go and be with Father, what's so bad about that?
Yeah.
It's just...
Yeah, I feel the same way.
I mean, we all say, well, we want to go home and be with him, but then when it comes, nobody wants to die to get there. So, it's just one of those things.
Right.
But, the why questions are really, really hard. And I think a lot of people also have a problem with when Father doesn't answer the prayers and they don't get what they want and they build up an animosity. Even people that love him a great deal will have their faith, and it's like, well, what about what I want?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I never know how to answer that question because my daughter just asked me that question recently.
Yeah.
I said, well, maybe you want something that's bad for you. I had no answer for her.
Right. Well, it's true that, as humans, we sometimes have very short-sighted desires and needs and wants, and they may not always be in our own best interest. So that's why you hear often people, and including me, saying that you want the Father's will to be done and not my own will.
But does it not take a while to get to the point where you realize your will is not always what's best? It took me a while to get there.
Oh, yeah, it certainly does. And, I think you're right. Some people get very angry with God and move away. It sort of comes back to faith. And, I've been on search committees of churches searching for senior ministers and associate ministers, and I've interviewed a lot of candidates. And, there are a couple of pastors who made the statement in an interview that they have doubts about their faith every day. And I thought to myself, how sad that is, because I don't have doubts every day. In fact, I rarely have any doubts. It's just I don't. And again, it was that early experience that I had. I really felt God's presence, and have felt God's presence many times since then. Not in the same way as that 12-year-old experience, but, in other ways. And that comes through in, the stories in my book where I like to say there are no coincidences. I think there are coincidences, but, to make the point, I say you ought to at least look at things that seem highly improbable and just too remotely coincidental. You ought to at least ask yourself the question, is it possible that God is directing this? And it's not just by chance that this happened. I heard the story today on the radio about this guy off the coast of Africa. Did you hear this? He went down in a ship to the bottom of the ocean. It wasn't real deep where he went down. It was like 150 feet or something like that. And I guess it's hit YouTube. It's like millions of people have viewed the video, where he was in this boat at the bottom of the ocean for 3 days and survived in an air pocket.
Wow.
And then got rescued. And he was praying during that period. He was quoting Bible. He was quoting Scripture. And, there's no way to view that as anything but a miracle. I mean, how does somebody sink to the bottom of the ocean and get rescued after 3 days? It's amazing. God has to be in it.
You hear stories like that, and then you hear the other ones where people aren't rescued. And
yeah,
it is sometimes to... I'm glad I don't have to make those decisions, though.
Yeah.
Above my pay grade,
Yeah, right.
But I guess it must boil down to Father's will in each of our lives on an individual basis.
I think
where
so.
we are.
Plus, your point's a very good one about free will. There is evil out there. There are people doing awful things. I mean, you think about the abuse of children and the sexual abuse of children, and it's just unspeakable, unfathomable, and yet it happens, and there's evil in the world.
There's evil, and the children have no fault in anything that goes on, and yet it does affect them for a long time unless they're...
Yeah, absolutely.
So.
Well, this is why I've been so upbeat and positive in my book. I don't want to dwell on all the negative stuff. I want to tell people the great stories about blessings in my life.
But I think it's the good stories that keep us through the bad stories.
Yeah, and back to what we were talking about earlier, it's so spiritually powerful for people to tell those stories, to tell them to other people. I mean, I know one of the guys who read my book before it was released, called me and he didn't even want to put it in an email. He called me and over the phone told me this wonderful story about he was in an airplane that got shot down in the Korean War, and he prayed to God, as this plane was crashing, that he be saved and be spared, and he promised to be faithful the rest of his life. And, he crashed in this plane and came out of it without a scratch. And I said to him, can you write that story up for my website? And he didn't do it. And he said, look, it's too personal. I don't want to tell it. And I said, but you know how many people you could affect by telling that story? It was like the guy who was in that ship. It just reinforces people's faith. And he didn't tell it. I just saw him a few days ago, and I didn't have time to really talk through all that with him again, but I'm going to work on him some more and see if he won't write up the story, because it's a wonderful story about God intervened to save his life.
And
so much
we're told in the book of Revelations that we overcome. Okay, let me see if I can remember this properly. I'm not good at this verse memorization. I remember concepts more than words, but we overcome by our testimony. The overcomers will overcome by our testimony.
Yeah.
So in order to have a testimony, you have to have some experiences. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think most people do. Most Christians, strong Christians, definitely have had some life-changing experiences. It's not just that they were raised that way. And in my case, I wasn't raised that way. But, we have these experiences, and it's difficult. I know it's difficult to share because, I get pretty emotional when I'm talking about some of these things. And it's really hard, especially if you're in a group and there's several people listening and you start to tell a story that impacted you profoundly, and it's difficult. No one wants to break down and sob in front of their friends, and yet you sometimes get overwhelmed when you think about these experiences. But, I think if you've done it a couple of times, I took the Dale Carnegie course once, many years ago, and they purposely had a session, the speaking, how to win friends, influence people, speaking course, and they purposely had a session near the end where they asked people to tell a highly emotional story about an experience in their life. And, many of the people in that class broke down crying uncontrollably, but they were supported by the whole group. Everybody understood. And that was including me. I got very emotional. And the fact that you tell the story 2, 3, 4, 5 times, you get to the point where you can control your emotions better. And you realize that it's affecting your audience in a very, very powerful way. So it needs to be told. And, I don't press people to tell their stories, but my book is encouraging them to at least recall their story. And then, my website, I've had a lot of people submit their own stories to the website. It's easier to do in writing sometimes than to do verbally. And I think getting those stories out there just has a very powerful spiritual effect on people.
Well, it does. I know I enjoy your website tremendously. It's been quite a blessing to me because it sort of confirms what you're going through yourself, that you're not in this alone.
Right.
Nobody likes to be alone. And just, if people could fully understand what a blessing it is to share their stories, I think more would do it.
Yep. Yeah, by the way, I should just mention the website. We mentioned it. It's also called GodRevealed.com. So if anybody's interested in going there, and you don't want to quite buy the book yet, some of the stories from the book are on the website. The book itself has additional stories that aren't on the website, but you could pick a few samples there and read them. Two of the ones that were really very powerful to me, and I won't tell the stories now, but one was when I took a trip to Africa with my son, Zachary, and I think it's called Lessons for the Affluent in Africa. That you could find that on the website. That was a very powerful story. And then there's another one about my special needs daughter, Denise, called Johnny's Yard. That's also, that story I have trouble telling myself to others without breaking down. I mean, it's a very emotional story for me. And, there's several like that. So if people want to visit GodRevealed.com, they'll get a feel for that, and then maybe they'll be interested in picking up the book as well. By the way, Dorothy, all of the gross proceeds from my book are going to charity. So, I'm not even trying to recover any costs I incurred with editing and things like that. It's the gross revenues are going to go to charity.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, well, the whole idea was really to impact people's lives. It really was not to sell millions of books and make a lot of money. That wasn't it at all. And just to confirm that and reinforce that, I'm going to give the gross revenues to charity. But it's really about my own passion for impacting other people's lives in a very positive way, and that's what I'm trying to do through the book and through the website. The power, the amazing thing is the power of social media.
Isn't it awesome? It's really
incredible.
something.
I mean, I put up this website about a year and a half ago, and I actually hired someone part-time as a consultant to help set it up and then to promote it. And we've had 175,000 visitors in that year and a half on the website, and I've got over 90,000 Facebook likes, and I've got over 45,000 Twitter followers. So, I've just sort of been astounded by how the social media can reach a huge audience. It's almost like the old chain letters. One person, retweets a message that came to them from Twitter to all their followers, and then those followers retweet to their followers, and suddenly, you quickly have touched, thousands of people who may or may not do anything about it, but at least they're aware of your message and your website or your Twitter site or your Facebook page. So it's really amazing how you can impact a lot of people with a good message.
Yes, it is. And, yeah, a lot of people don't like Facebook. I use it mostly for news and sharing the shows with them.
Right.
But it is amazing how many people, how it goes along the way. And it's not like one of those chain letters you get that,
right.
Send me $1 and you'll get thousands back.
Yeah, right. It's the same concept, but with a little different purpose.
And I was thinking when you mentioned Dale Carnegie, if I said that to one of my kids, they go, "Who is that?" I just kept myself. That was a big deal when he came out with that.
Yeah, How to Win Friends and Influence People. That book was probably written in the 50s or something like that. But if you take a look at it, it's still pretty applicable.
Mhm. Yes, it is. Well, we're getting down to the close of the show. Is there anything I did want to share with you guys that when you go to the Amazon link for the purchase of the book, they will send you a sample if you request it, and that gives you an overview of the whole book as well as far as the intent of the book. So
yeah, you can click on the look inside, and read a little bit. I've given a bit of the background here now. A lot of it's in the preface and the introduction to the book, which may or may not be visible on Amazon. And there's a lot on that site that gives background on me and why I wrote the book, some of the things we talked about tonight. So, yeah, you could take a look at that. The website says the book won't be available till February, but that's really just the official release date. In truth, what's happening is this week Amazon is starting to fulfill orders, which means that anybody who orders the book now will get it before Christmas. So, I had one of the agents at New York Life got 50 copies to give to her top clients. And, so I think they'll make a good Christmas gift. And I did hear today from my publisher some very good news that in my category, which I think is faith and religion, it's now been categorized as one of Amazon's pre-order bestsellers. So, I'm very encouraged that already people have made a lot of pre-orders. And I'm also on December 19th, a week from now, or a couple weeks from now, I'm going to be doing satellite interviews with a lot of affiliates of the network TV stations, Fox, NBC, ABC, CBS.
Oh, really? You got on Fox. That'll give you some good exposure,
well,
too.
What I'm on right now, I'm on the local affiliates in a few cities, and we're going to do that by satellite. So I don't know all the cities that we're going to be doing. So it won't be on the national Fox News. However, if they like the presentation, I'm told that, it's quite likely I'd end up on the national level as well. So hopefully, people get to see me live, or they can go to the YouTube site, God Revealed Book, I think is what it's called. The username is God Revealed Book, no dots or dashes, where I am speaking on video and answering a lot of questions, more than we even covered today, about the book and about some of my experience. I actually tell a couple of the stories in the book on video. So if anybody's interested, they can go into YouTube and view some of those as well. And
share them on their Facebook pages.
Yeah, please. That'd be great.
That'd be good, too. So, are those your closing comments, or do you have anything else?
Well, I think that's it. I just would encourage your listeners to, even if they don't buy my book, to think back as I did on, struggles, difficult times in your life, times when you felt you had failed, times when you felt God wasn't answering your prayers, in accordance with your desires. Think back on that, and as I was saying earlier, kind of rewind the tapes and replay them, and ask yourself the question, how did I get through that? What was the ultimate outcome? Do I see, years later that it really worked out very well, and maybe God had it right, and I had it wrong in terms of what I really wanted, and His will is better than my will in terms of my life and my future. And hopefully they'll come up with some examples like I did, and then if they really want to impact other people's lives, share those stories. Share those stories in church, in study groups, in Sunday school class, whatever. By the way, that's another use of my book that's been already there are 15 study groups, church groups, using the book for discussion along these very lines. And one of them is not a church group, it's a home for unwed mothers, prostitutes, drug addicts, where they're using the book, with the staff to try and kind of reinforce and share stories of their own faith as they go out and minister to young women, in this case, who really are in need of intervention. So I'm very encouraged that that's been a positive aspect and almost a ministry in terms of the outreach of the book itself.
I know when I first saw it, the first thing I thought of was what an impressive tool to just help people walk the walk instead of just talking.
Yeah. I think the publishers liked that idea. It was sort of a unique approach, a little different than a lot of the other faith-based books that you read. And this whole idea of getting people to reflect on their own past and, in a way, if you can identify these experiences, these encounters with God, it will fortify and enrich your future. And I don't think there's any question that your faith can be enhanced through those kinds of recollections and those stories. Well, Dorothy, thank you very much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for coming. I really enjoyed this interview. And feel free to promote it any way you can. I will do my best to promote it.
Well, thank you.
And don't be surprised if you get other calls from other Blog Talk hosts.
Okay. I'm happy to do it. And my voice held up better than I thought it would.
Yeah. Once the word gets out,
Yeah.
they'll be wanting you to make the rounds. So.
Okay. Thank you, Dorothy. God
Thank
bless.
you.
Yep.
Father bless. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for downloading it in the archive. Until next time, Father bless and keep.